Washington, D.C. is a city filled with monuments, politicians, presidents, and stories that have survived for generations. But hidden among its grand buildings and historic streets are stories of a different kind. Stories about people who died suddenly. Stories about places where tragedy seems to have left something behind. And among Washington's most famous haunted legends is the story of a woman named Marian Clover Adams. Her death was real. Her grief was real. Her final moments were real. But according to a legend that has survived for more than a century, something of Clover Adams may have remained behind. Something that never accepted that she was gone. Today, the elegant Hay Adams Hotel stands across from the White House, one of Washington's most prestigious hotels. From the outside, it looks almost impossibly refined. Its stone walls, polished halls, chandeliers, expensive rooms, and views of Lafayette Square seem completely at odds with the story associated with it. Because after dark, some people say the building feels different. The corridors become strangely quiet. The atmosphere seems heavier. And according to the legend, there are moments when a woman can be heard crying somewhere inside the hotel. The strange part is that the woman supposedly isn't there. And perhaps even stranger, some believe she never really left. Before she became the ghost of a famous Washington hotel, Marian Hooper Adams was a real woman. She was born into a prominent Boston family and was known by the nickname Clover. She was intelligent, artistic, independent, and deeply interested in photography. She eventually married Henry Adams, a historian and member of one of America's most influential families. The couple moved to Washington, D.C., where they became part of the city's social and intellectual world. Their home stood at 1607 H Street, NW, close to what would eventually become the site of the Hay Adams Hotel. At the time, however, there was no Hay Adams Hotel. There were no luxury suites, no tourists, no polished lobby, no elevators carrying guests through the night. Washington looked very different, and Clover Adams's life appeared, at least from the outside, to be equally respectable. But beneath that appearance, something was beginning to change. In 1885, Clover experienced a devastating personal loss. Her father died. For Clover, the loss was overwhelming. People who knew her described a woman whose emotional condition deteriorated severely. She became deeply depressed. Her husband, Henry Adams, could see that something was wrong. But grief is difficult to understand from the outside. Sometimes the person sitting across from you can look perfectly normal while fighting a battle that no one else can see. And in 19th century America, there was very little understanding of severe depression compared with what we know today. There were few resources, few treatments, and almost no language for describing the darkness that can consume a person from within. Then came December 6, 1885. It was an ordinary day in Washington, until it wasn't. Clover Adams had access to potassium cyanide because of her photographic work. The chemical was extremely dangerous, and on that December day, she swallowed it. She died at her home. She was only 42 years old. Her death devastated Henry Adams. But something about the circumstances of her death would later become an important part of the ghost story. Because Clover's death wasn't simply tragic. It was sudden. It was violent. And it happened in a home that stood within the historical area later associated with the Hay Adams. Decades would pass. The original buildings would disappear. Washington would change. And eventually, a magnificent hotel would rise on the site. But the story of Clover Adams would remain. Nearly 4 decades after Clover's death, the landscape around the site had transformed. The Hay Adams Hotel was constructed in the 1920s and opened in 1928. Its name came from 2 famous Washington families. John Hay had been a statesman and diplomat. Henry Adams, Clover's husband, was a historian and writer. The hotel was designed to become one of Washington's most luxurious addresses. Presidents would stay there. Foreign diplomats would pass through its doors. Politicians would meet there. Celebrities would sleep in its rooms. And wealthy travelers would arrive expecting nothing but elegance. But according to the legend, they weren't always alone. Imagine walking through the hotel late at night. The lobby is almost empty. The lights are dim. The elevators have stopped moving. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the faint sound of footsteps. You stop. Silence. You continue walking. Then you hear something else. A woman's voice. Not speaking. Crying. At first, it sounds distant. Almost impossible to identify. You look down the corridor. Nothing. You check another hallway. Still nothing. Then the crying seems to come from behind you. You turn around. Nothing. According to the legend surrounding the Hay Adams, experiences like this have contributed to its reputation as one of Washington's haunted locations. And the woman supposedly responsible is Clover Adams. One of the most disturbing elements of the legend is the idea that Clover's ghost isn't always heard. Sometimes she is supposedly seen. A woman dressed in old-fashioned clothing. A pale figure appearing briefly at the end of a hallway. A shadow moving across a doorway. And then nothing. No footsteps. No opening door. No explanation. Of course, these accounts are stories. They have never been proven. But ghost stories rarely survive because they can be proven. They survive because people keep telling them. And the Hay Adams story has accumulated another strange detail. A scent. Some versions of the legend claim that people have occasionally noticed a mysterious floral scent inside the hotel. A smell appearing without an obvious source. There is something particularly unsettling about unexplained smells. You can't see them. You can't grab them. But suddenly they are there. You walk into an empty room and smell perfume. You leave and the smell disappears. You return later and it is back. Some retellings connect this mysterious scent with Clover Adams. Others have associated the story with the smell of almonds because of the cyanide involved in her death. But there is no reliable evidence establishing that either scent is actually connected to Clover's ghost. Still, the story became part of the hotel's supernatural reputation. And then there were the sounds. Imagine being a hotel guest. It is around 2 in the morning. You are lying in bed. The city outside has finally become quiet. But you hear crying. At first, you assume it's coming from another room. You listen. The sound stops. Then it begins again. A woman, softly sobbing. You get out of bed. You open your door. The hallway is empty. You listen again. Nothing. You return to your room. Close the door. And just as you climb back into bed, the crying begins again. Only this time, it sounds closer. That is the kind of scene that has made the Clover Adams legend so effective. Not a monster. Not a demon. Not something attacking guests. Just a woman who seems to be mourning. Over and over. Night after night. As if whatever happened in 1885 never truly ended. But there is something about this story that makes it more disturbing than an ordinary ghost tale. Clover Adams wasn't a fictional character. She wasn't invented to scare tourists. She existed. She had a husband. She had a family. She had photographs. She had friends. She had a home. And then she died. Her husband was left behind to deal with the consequences. Henry Adams never completely recovered from the loss. Years later, he would create one of the most famous memorials in American history. The sculpture became known as the Adams Memorial. It stands in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington. The statue depicts a mysterious seated figure. Its face is partly hidden. Its posture is solemn. Its expression is impossible to read. And its atmosphere is deeply unsettling. Henry Adams reportedly worked with sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens to create the memorial. The result has often been interpreted as representing grief, death, mystery, and the unknown. Standing before it today, it is difficult not to imagine the pain behind its creation. A husband trying to create something that could somehow express what words could not. The Hay Adams is now a luxury hotel. Thousands of people have stayed there. Most leave with nothing more unusual than a pleasant memory. There is no verified evidence that a ghost walks the corridors. No scientific investigation has established that Clover Adams's spirit remains there. No photograph has conclusively captured her apparition. No recording has proven that the crying heard by some visitors comes from a supernatural source. And yet, the legend refuses to disappear. Perhaps because the story contains something that every ghost story needs. A real death. a real tragedy, a real location, and a question that cannot be answered. What happens to a person's pain after they are gone? There is another way to look at the story. Maybe the hotel isn't haunted. Maybe the human mind is. Hotels are strange places. People come and go constantly. The walls carry unfamiliar sounds. Pipes knock. Elevators move. Doors close. Air conditioning systems hum. Voices travel through corridors. Someone crying in another room can sound like it's coming from somewhere else entirely. A floral scent can come from perfume, cleaning products, flowers, or ventilation systems. A shadow at the end of a hallway can be nothing more than a reflection. And when you already know that a place has a ghost story, your brain begins looking for evidence. A sound becomes a whisper. A shadow becomes a figure. A smell becomes the perfume of a dead woman. Fear fills in the gaps that reality leaves behind. But there is still something uncomfortable about the Hay Adams story, because the legend is attached to a genuine historical tragedy. And sometimes, that is enough to make a building feel haunted. Picture the hotel again. It is late. The lights are low. The last guests have gone to their rooms. A security guard walks through an empty corridor. Everything appears normal. Then he hears footsteps. He stops. Nothing. He continues. Another sound. A woman's quiet sobbing. He turns toward the hallway. Empty. He walks closer. The crying seems to fade. He turns around. And for just a moment, there is a woman standing at the far end of the corridor. She is motionless. Her face is difficult to see. The guard blinks. She's gone. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe it was another guest. Maybe his tired mind played a trick on him. Or maybe, for one brief moment, Clover Adams was there. Not because she wanted to frighten anyone, but because she was still looking for something she had lost. Her home, her husband, her life, or perhaps simply, the truth about the Hay Adams is more complicated than the legend suggests. Clover Adams really lived. She really suffered a devastating loss. She really died in 1885 after ingesting potassium cyanide. Her husband really mourned her, and a magnificent memorial really was created in her memory. But the ghost? That part remains a mystery. The Hay Adams Hotel did not exist when Clover died. She did not die inside the present hotel, and there is no conclusive evidence that her spirit has ever appeared there. The stories of crying, unexplained scents, strange sensations, and apparitions belong to the realm of folklore. But perhaps that doesn't make the story less frightening, because sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones we can prove. They're the ones that begin with something real and leave us wondering what happened afterward. So if you ever find yourself in Washington, D.C., standing outside the elegant Hay Adams Hotel, look up at the windows. Think about the woman whose tragic life became part of the building's mythology. And if you happen to stay there and wake sometime after midnight, listen carefully, because if the stories are true, you may hear something very faint, a woman's voice, a quiet sob, coming from somewhere down the hallway. You open your door. There is nobody there. You listen again. Silence. Then, just before you close the door, you catch the faintest trace of perfume. And somewhere in the darkness, a woman begins to cry.